today. I'm really excited about today's session because we are hearing about a number of research from a number of different cases, contexts, and theories. And so we are going to be hearing from Andrew, Carla, Ben, and Salil, who are all either current or recently minted PhDs who are doing research on different forms of labor solidarity and collective action. And so one goal of this session is really to highlight implications for scholarship and research. A second goal is to highlight implications for practice. And so we're very privileged to be joined by Eric from the Laborers Union, who is going to serve as our discussant. And so we will hear from all four of our speakers. We will take a brief pause to look at a summary of the implications for theory and practice that they have identified in their research before turning things over to Eric and then opening things up for Q&A. As with our other panels, please feel free to add questions into the chat. I'll be keeping track. Our panelists, when they are not presenting, will also be checking the chat and can respond to questions that way as well. And so with that, I will turn things over to Andrew to kick us off.
Thanks, Christine. Can everyone see my slides? All good? Okay, great. Thanks, Christine, for pulling this all together. And I'm so grateful to be on this panel with some other really fantastic young scholars. And also I have a lot of gratitude for being able to connect with folks during COVID, to hear about their experiences during COVID and how sort of solidarity emerged among workers where you think it might not happen, which is independent contractors in the cultural industry. So I'd love to share a little bit about how I got into this, because I usually focus on healthcare. And winter of 2019, 2020, I was doing an ethnography in New York City on the introduction of a new role in healthcare. And then obviously COVID made it incredibly challenging to do any sort of meaningful work on the ground with frontline essential workers. And so I was trying to think about, you know, what would be other useful work that could be done during COVID. And so I was thinking about folks whose work is not deemed essential, folks like those in nightlife entertainment, who were probably going to be the last folks to be able to get back to their job. And so as I was interviewing folks in nightlife entertainment in a specific city, I sort of fell into a puzzle that I'd like to share with all of you. And I'll use two of my informants to illustrate this. And just so everyone knows, all names and all images are pseudonyms and not real images of my informants. Of course, I want to protect the privacy of all of my informants, but I'll share two folks with you. One is Devin, who's a white man in his early 30s, who on top of DJing on the weekends and weeknights also is a superintendent at a school. And COVID was an incredibly challenging time for him because he also had a newborn baby that he and his wife were taking care of. So there were a lot of things going on in Devin's life, and yet he still found a way to transition to digital work during COVID and started his own DJ collective during COVID. And I contrast Devin with Pepper, who is a white, non-binary entertainer in the early 40s who's been involved in nightlife for over 2 decades. And Pepper also has a really great job in tech that they do alongside all of this DJ work. And while Pepper was trying to orchestrate some digital nightlife work, they found it incredibly arduous, really tedious, not very rewarding, very uncertain. And so Pepper withdrew from doing all of this digital work while Devin really stayed engaged in all of this work, even though their circumstances were probably pretty similar. And what I heard from Devin and a lot of people that worked with Devin was this idea of worker solidarity. And what I heard from Pepper and other folks who responded similarly to Pepper was this notion of resignation about the future of what their work is going to look like and fear about the future. So I just want to share quickly a little bit about methods and theory before I can really get into the data for you all. But so I did semi-structured interviews with 32 folks in a local nightlife in a specific city. These were paid interviews. Folks were given $75 for their time. And I used snowball sampling. So this was also a highly networked sample. Folks were pretty aware of each other. And I started in queer nightlife, but asked to see if I could learn from folks who were in non-queer nightlife. And I first thought that this was going to be a story about reopening, that I started this in June of last year. And I don't know if you remember, restaurants were starting to try to reopen. And I thought this was going to be about worker voice. And instead, obviously, it was the story about digital entertainment. And so really started honing in on questions around digital entertainment. But when we think about worker solidarity, there's sort of the behavioral side of it, and then also the affective side of it. So the behavioral is sort of what we think of as boycotts and strikes and campaigns. And then there's still this important affective sort of cognitive side of worker solidarity, which, informed by other scholars, I define as this sort of sense of commitment to a group of other workers. But it's specific knowledge. It's not abstract. It's, you know who to support and you know the content of the support. So this isn't some broad idea of worker solidarity, of worker consciousness. This is very specific and tangible and practical to folks on the ground. And in the literature, we kind of have three competing theories about how solidarity might emerge. One is this sort of Marxist notion that workers objectively understand that they have shared interest in the labor process, whereas more sort of in line with the critical IR tradition is the importance of local leaders, organizational actors, who can socialize an injustice frame, that there's a way that we can help engage the subjectivity of workers. And then more contemporary work has really focused on network ties and relationships and friendships, and really using that as a way to create stability and sustainability in what might otherwise look as very ephemeral solidarity, that these boundary spanners and these networks can help distribute ideas and maintain social norms. But I'm kind of unsatisfied with this a little bit. I have two theoretical issues that I think I can hopefully address with some of my data, which one is that we shouldn't just focus on the rhetoric of this frame, that we need to get the words right, that workers can hear it. And once we give them this injustice frame, they receive it. But rather that framing is this process, that we really need to understand what are the practices, what can we do to tangibly get this frame to resonate with folks. And then the other aspect for folks who are more focused on networks is to remember that these are not just passive objects that you can just instrumentalize, but rather that it's full of other people with other commitments and ideas and meaning making. And so there's going to be ways in which networks can really help facilitate solidarity and other ways in which it might limit the opportunity. And within my own context, with independent contracting for cultural workers, there are really two things that can make it hard for solidarity to emerge. One is that, this is a highly fissured context where workers are casually connected to employers and occupations. They can kind of supplement this work with other jobs. There are attrition issues. So it can be really hard to identify and connect other workers to make worker solidarity really practical for them. And then the other side is that it can be hard to frame this sort of sense of injustice when workers are drawn to work that is cool and autonomous, and that it's the precarious arrangement of itself that might make it cool and autonomous. And so where we have the opportunity is within these networks, because this is how the work is often organized for cultural work, that employers really rely on networks of independent contractors to organize these projects. But that, again, we need to remember that just because there are these instrumental ties between folks doesn't mean that that instrumentality will mean solidarity to them, right? It might just remain this economic exchange. And so what I saw was, as folks were transitioning to digital life for their work, the folks in the network that I was talking with really were sharing strategies. What's the right platform to use? What sorts of tools do we need to respond? What kind of music or visuals really can resonate with the audience during this time? And as folks were sort of exploring this, again, I remind you, there were like these two distinct strategies, that there were two distinct responses, that there was this withdrawal, but there was also this sustained engagement. And so for those who, sorry, my slides are not changing. Okay, yeah, for those who sort of really stayed engaged, what I saw was fascinating, that they developed this sort of their own organization. They developed their own almost media networks where they developed communal ownership, communal sharing of gigs, they were sharing tips. And something that was really important to a lot of them was there was a lot of important affective labor that they did in the chat, sort of affirming each other during this time when their work maybe was seen as not important as something that would be for our critical infrastructure like healthcare and food services, that there was all this affective labor that was done in the chat, and also producing work that maybe wouldn't work in a club setting, slower work that could have more political content to it, where there was one artist who was talking about how they could use a slower Stevie Wonder song to sort of have a meaningful response to what was going on in response to the murder of George Floyd, that there could be a really beautiful piece that could recognize their racial identity. And so what emerged from what I heard from folks as they were as they were participating in this was really the sense of solidarity. There was this notion that they were a family, but also that there was something about them being together that made it seem possible, that there was another way that work could be organized, that what they were doing was better, and that what management usually does is pretty unjust. And with Pepper, I realize that I'm running out of time here, so I'm just speeding through. But with Pepper had this experience that was really sort of arduous and isolating. It didn't feel like a communal experience to them. And so what I learned was the folks who really resisted this digital work and this collective orientation was not because they were against any sort of communal projects, but because the work really conflicted with the early socialization, the cultural expectations they had about this type of work. And so just to quickly summarize, what I saw was that networks were really necessary, but not enough for facilitating solidarity across all of the workers in my setting. But that contributing to a communal project like Fantasia, found in cultures of solidarity, can really help develop the sense of us, but it doesn't even have to be as extreme as a strike. It could even be something a little bit less combative, that still these communal projects can help develop a sense of us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Andrew. You clocked in right on time, so it's perfect. We're going to go to Carla next.
Just a second. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carla Lima. In this opportunity, I will be presenting evidence from the 2019 UAW GM strike, a research project in collaboration with Dr. Ibsen, Dr. DeOrtentiis, and Dr. Tapia from Michigan State University. Is there solidarity with the temporary workers? I will provide a brief background. Since 1993, there have been a total of 22 work stoppages involving GM. The largest occurred in 1998 and involved more than 150,000 workers and over 3 million of workdays lost. The work stoppage of September 2019, which is highlighted here, was the 5th largest in terms of number of workers involved and 2nd largest in terms of cumulative lost workdays. In this recent stoppage, the new contract was approved by 57% of workers eligible to vote. It is important to highlight the following outcomes contemplated in the new contract. GM agreed to give workers $1,000 for every billion the company earns. As part of the deal, workers received a ratification bonus, permanent workers $11,000 and temporary workers $4,500, which actually basically covered the wages they lost during the strike. And in addition, there is now a process of temporary workers to become permanent employees after 3 years instead of on the job, and for newer hires to earn a full pay rate in 4 years instead of 8. In 2019, negotiations were drawn out as they have been before, and various barriers had to be addressed. However, temporary workers or atypical workers played a role this time. GM wanted to hire temporary workers and trim down its healthcare costs. In effect, there are often 4 tiers of workers in a GM plant. Jobs off the assembly line, such as janitorial and logistics, have been outsourced to other companies that pay far less. And GM has hired temporary workers, often performing the same work as a tier 2 or tier 1 workers, but they receive a lower hourly rate, less benefits, no profit sharing, and only 3 days off a year, which are unpaid. They are not actually temporary because they have been working for GM for years. And there were an estimated of 7% of temporary workers within the GM workforce by 2019. All of which led us to ask, do typical workers act in solidarity with their atypical workers? The strike began in September 16, and the labor contract was reached between the union and company negotiators on October 16, but strikers remained on the picket lines until it was ratified. Within this period, our first study attempted to identify motivations for being in strike and whether solidarity with temporary workers was present. Later, UAW members approved the labor deal and ended the strike. And after this process with our second study, we attempted to identify motivations for voting yes to the agreement and trying to identify whether solidarity with temporary workers was present at this final stage of collective action. The deregulation of labor markets and increasing demands of employers for flexible work practices have been challenging solidarity between workers as work has featured in advanced economies such as the US. Overall, typical workers enjoy better wages and job protection due to the existence of temporary workers. And typical workers need their temporary workers as a buffer in hard times. Most likely, typical workers will not act in solidarity with their counterparts. However, as this global economic crisis has also made typical workers vulnerable to unemployment, wage cuts, and benefits reductions, now typical or the core workforce is increasingly in solidarity with their counterparts. When compelled then by this moral rhetoric that goes beyond economic costs and benefits, solidarity is then the right thing to do. In terms of values, political orientations in American thoughts matter, and feelings and behaviors are particularly significant. Those who draw positively on conservatism often support the preservation of traditional values, social control, and capitalism, while Americans who draw positively on liberalism often support reform, progress, and equality with positive attitudes towards marginalized groups such as temporary workers. Therefore, the political orientation of American typical workers can influence their solidarity. Although it is likely that typical workers are likely to reach an agreement with suboptimal gains for temporary workers, there is also evidence, though, that from Germany, for example, the typical workers and employers can come to agreements that also address the needs of atypical workers. Finally, workers in the GM strike demonstrated responsible citizenship by voting for or against a new contract. Their participation in the election polls may have been impacted by their satisfaction with the union and satisfaction with the employer, in addition to their solidaristic and economic motives. Our first study considered insider status for typical workers, solidarity reasons, and liberal and conservative identification. We controlled for gender and union membership since we had the opportunity to work with 2 UAW locals. Our analytical approach was structural equation modeling. There is limited research focusing on the instances in which typical workers demonstrate solidarity with their atypical colleagues. We contended then that given the use of temporary workers as a buffer in hard times, the insider status negatively relates with solidarity reasons to strike. And in addition, we hypothesized that liberal identification positively relates with solidarity reasons, and in contrast, conservative identification negatively relates with solidarity reasons. We found support for hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2A, and at this stage of the work stoppage, both a worker's insider status and a worker's liberal identification are important elements of solidarity with temporary workers. Solidaristic reasons may be more value-oriented rather than driven by instrumental motives. Our second study considered the same variables as study 1, plus ratification vote, extrinsic reasons, union satisfaction, and employer satisfaction, controlling again for gender and union, and in addition, organizational loyalty. This last one included, given that simultaneous loyalty to the employer and the union has been considered in previous research, providing evidence that loyalty to both instances is possible even in the context of conflicting relations. Our analytical approach was similar to study 1. We examined the robustness of our first study with hypothesis 1 and 2. We predicted with hypothesis 3 positive relation between insider status and ratification vote. Hypothesis 4 predicted a negative relation between liberal identification and ratification vote, while hypothesis 4b predicted a positive relation between conservative identification and ratification vote. Hypothesis 5 predicted indirect effects of insider status on the ratification vote through solidarity reasons, extrinsic reasons, union satisfaction, and employer satisfaction. Hypothesis 6 and 7 similarly predicted indirect effects for liberal identification and conservative identification. Unlike study 1, we found support only for hypothesis 1, providing additional support for the negative relation between insider status and solidarity reasons. From all the hypothesized direct and indirect relations, we do find significant indirect effects as shown in this slide. At this stage, political identification is no longer related to solidarity reasons to strike. Extrinsic reasons comprising gratification bonus and profit sharing is an important mediator between political identification, both liberal and conservative, and insider status with the ratification vote. And we can see that the vote of traditional worker takes into consideration not only solidarity towards temporary workers, but also the gains with the new contract and the performance of the union. We can reach some general conclusions. During the strike, workers with liberal identification express more solidarity with atypical workers in comparison to insiders or typical workers. And when voting, extrinsic reasons, meaning economic gains, seem to be most important, and the most important reason for voting yes to the agreement for both liberals and insiders. Is stock cheap? When constraints are tighter, solidarity appears to be more complex and difficult to sustain. And well, during the strike and reaching a collective agreement, typical workers showed willingness to put atypical workers at the center. Solidarity has its limits, and insiders have legitimate economic interests as well. Collective bargaining and solidarity exist in processes or stages, and so representatives may need to work building bonds between the core and the periphery of the workforce. And thank you for your attention, and we will be interested in hearing your thoughts and comments of these findings.
Excellent, thank you, Carla. We will now turn things over to Ben.
Great, hello everyone. Let's see, do you see my screen?
Not yet.
No, all right. I'm sorry, give me a second. As I'm bringing that up here and enjoying the wonderful world of Zoom, I have two screens connected. That's the problem. Give me a second here. My presentation is on worker centers and labor unions, and I'm going to try this again here. Do you see it now?
That worked. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So. My presentation is called A Tale of Two Campaigns, Opportunities and Challenges for Collaboration Between Immigrant Worker Centers and Labor Unions. And really glad to be here today with all of you. So for those of you who don't know, and I suspect most in this crowd do know, but a brief overview is that worker centers are community-based, community-led nonprofit organizations, and they do the following three things for low-wage workers in order to fit the definition. First, they provide services such as English as a second language classes. Secondly, they organize workers for better benefits and working conditions and organize collective action and solidarity. And three, they advocate for legislation to fight wage theft, among other issues. Importantly, worker centers are funded mainly by foundations and other sources, including individual donors, in contrast to labor unions, which are funded mainly by membership dues. And also critically, they cannot collectively bargain with employers. And right here is a photo. This is from my field work in the greater Boston area. This is the Brazilian Worker Center. Just keep that image in mind as I'm going through my slides. But it looks rather similar to a union hall, as you can see. A lot of chairs there for training. Really brief literature review. This presentation is going to heavily focus on practice, so I'm not going into the literature and the theory a whole lot. As many of you probably know, Janice Fine in particular, along with Ruth Milkman and some other scholars like Victor Naro, who I think is on the call, have done a number of studies on worker centers, on their internal processes, and there also has been a decent body of research on collaborative campaigns. The prime study being Fine 2007, which I drew upon and extended fairly heavily in this study. But these studies have been fairly limited in terms of their geographical scope. Most of the extant research has focused on New York and Los Angeles and several other large metropolitan areas, primarily with high union density. My research here focused on greater Boston, which is another metro area, but significantly smaller than New York and Chicago. It is a higher union density area, but simply different geographically. And I also focus on a different time period. There hasn't been a whole lot of literature really, in the past 5 years in particular, but most of the research was done prior to the Trump administration, certainly. So that's another unique perspective here. There's been insufficient evidence on why some of the campaigns in which unions and worker centers have collaborated succeed and while others do not, and what the opportunities and challenges are for future organizing collaborations. And very briefly, there have been several high-profile collaborations and partnerships nationally, including the Laborers Union partnering with New Labor in New Jersey to organize residential construction, the Carpenters and Chicago Interfaith Workers' Rights Center in 2003. And some of you probably know about Salil in the Twin Cities working with SEIU to get a responsible contracting policy at Target for janitors. The methods and data, this was a mixed methods study, my dissertation. This particular paper is primarily qualitative. I conducted semi-structured interviews averaging about 1 hour and a half in length with 29 individuals coming from 7 worker centers and 8 different labor unions, including both service sector and building trades unions. And they varied quite widely in terms of the type of unions. And the 7 worker centers were drawn from 9 worker centers that are part of a coalition called the Immigrant Worker Center Collaborative. And I also conducted observation, including at meetings and protest actions, as well as document review. And I designed an original structured survey instrument of 51 items, which was done in English and Spanish, n equals 27. And very briefly, a few of my survey items. The survey was a Likert scale survey, and a 1 represented a very strongly disagree, whereas a 7 represented very strongly agree. A few of the questions here, I'm not going to read all of them to you, but you can see these questions are about trust. And in particular, I was interested in whether there was a perception that immigrants trusted unions and worker centers differently. Some of my other questions revolved around resource issues and general views on collaboration. And I don't have time to go over all the survey data, but one of the more interesting points from the survey was that overall, respondents trust unions and worker centers virtually equally, a mean of 4.92 versus 4.95, and the standard deviation is also virtually identical. But, and this is a big but, participants from both worker centers and unions believe that worker centers are more trusted by immigrants than labor unions. So that was a pretty interesting finding. I expected that worker center respondents would believe this. I did not, however, believe that union respondents would also think that immigrants trust worker centers more than they trust unions. So union respondents were kind of admitting some of the challenges with the immigrant workforce in this case. I'm going to go over my campaigns really briefly because I want to respect people's time. The 2 campaigns I looked at, one was in the construction industry, the Laborers International Union, worked with the worker center in Eastern Rhode Island called Fuerza Laboral, and there were wage theft and health and safety issues at a demolition contractor called Skinner Demolition. There was a 2016 election involving 54 Latino workers, and they won the election by about a 2-to-1 margin, which is no simple feat in today's environment in which there are very aggressive anti-union campaigns, and there was a union busting campaign in this case. As you can see at the bottom here, there was some media coverage. There was a lot of coverage in WBUR in Boston, in public radio and some other outlets regarding wage theft and safety issues involving asbestos in the residential and commercial construction industries. Unfortunately, they were not able to achieve a union contract, and I can come back a little bit into why that was so, but just keep that in your mind. Importantly, however, despite the fact that they did not achieve a union contract, both parties indicated willingness to collaborate in the future. Adam Lupino from LIUNA, who was basically ran the campaign on the union side, said, "I'd like to do something with them again. They have access to a very skilled workforce. It's a lot of trust. It's a workforce that needs us." Raul Figueroa, who's the organizer from the Worker Center side, said about the laborers, they were open to different ideas that will help get better results. So you're seeing here kind of a willingness to collaborate in the future, despite the fact that they didn't achieve the desired outcome of union contract. Really briefly, because I'm going to run against time, I think, in a little bit, is the second campaign was the medical resources campaign involving home healthcare workers, approximately 250 of them, primarily female, Chinese and Spanish-speaking workers. And like the Fuerza Laboral campaign with Skinner, the Worker Center had a pre-existing relationship. They had the relationship with the workers before the union, and they essentially referred the workers to the union, which is important. This was also part of the National Fight for 15 campaign, which many of you are aware of. And the workers actually became aware of the union effort. The Chinese workers contacted the Worker Center because they saw in local media that other Chinese-speaking workers had gotten involved in the fight for 15. And after an organizing drive, including fighting private equity, they achieved victory in the summer of 2015. You see the workers here celebrating. And then the first contract was achieved in summer of 2016. And a really brief quote is, our membership meetings always have translators for Spanish, Chinese, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean Creole, Portuguese, French. We speak a lot of languages. We have our training fund graduation. Those are honestly one of our proudest moments, all different food, all different languages, cultures. It's great. And that's the SEIU 1199 organizing director. The findings from the two studies, and these are from this paper overall, were that first, Worker Center and union respondents indicated a clear openness to working together in the future, despite the fact that they didn't get contracts in both cases. And then the opportunities for collaboration revolved mainly around cultural and linguistic issues and access to immigrant workers, as we saw in both cases where the worker centers had a relationship with the workers first, and they had a high degree of trust. Something I can get back to in the discussion is there was a formal memorandum of agreement, and my analysis indicates that this MOU between the Chinese Progressive Association and SEIU was a really important variable in why that campaign succeeded. It kind of put the two parties at a similar level. And lastly, negotiating union contracts remain a challenge. Even in the SEIU case, there were a lot of misunderstandings. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ben. We'll turn things over to Salil.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, is it visible and am I audible?
We can see it, yes.
Okay, and can you hear me? Okay. Okay, hello everyone. I wish to extend my thanks to the organizers of this session for allowing me to present here. My name is Salil Sapre. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations at Michigan State. I'm working on this essay with Maite, Tapia, and we're trying to analyze, reimagine labor contestation and analyze how marginalized workers engage in contentious action. And we do so using critical race theory. So this chapter will go into the 2022 Lira volume on critical race theory and industrial relations. So any questions, comments, feedback are most welcome, because this is work in progress at this point. Okay. So we've embedded this work in the context of police brutality and racism. These were issues that were reintroduced into the mainstream national discourse since the beginning of 2020, and also the disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had on marginalized communities. Some have argued that 2020 witnessed the largest strike and protest wave. For instance, there were around 1,100 wildcat strikes observed. And of course, the Black Lives Matter movement took place that took not only the US by storm, but also the world. Curiously, though, mainstream labor scholars and practitioners perceive these movements as somewhat distinct from traditional labor contestation or even worker power. So what does the existing scholarship tell us? So we argue that there's been an emphasis on institutional forms of resistance, and there's also been a narrow focus on action in the industrial sphere, mostly organized by unions or organized labor. And the graph that we see here on the right is symptomatic of this trend. So for instance, since 1980, we see a dramatic decline in the number of workers participating or being involved in militant action up until 2018, when the teacher strikes happened. So we argue that there's a need to acknowledge a potential change in the causes as well as manifestations of labor contestation. And of course, the fact that color and gender blind analyses within industrial relations also need to be problematized. And more attention needs to be focused on non-economic origins as well as supra workplace causes or origins of contestation. So we go about this by bringing in counter narratives. We specifically focus on strikes and protest actions from 2020 because these events speak to the issues that we raised in the previous slide quite effectively. And we go about this using a two-pronged approach. So first, we re-emphasize that workers' social identities are not unidimensional or confined to class, and they extend to other spheres of existence as well. Speaking of marginalized workers, we argue that their struggles for social justice do not only encompass class issues, but also include causes emanating from intersectional oppression that they face in society. So to speak to this, we propose 3 attributes anchored in marginalized workers' intersectional oppression. This is our second prong, and we'll talk about these attributes in the next few slides. So what exactly are counter narratives? So the counter narrative approach borrows from critical race theory. So CRT or critical race theory argues that it's not possible to empower everyone unless erasure of experiences of the marginalized can be reversed. So the counter narrative approach is one component, one of the 6 components of CRT. So it brings forth voices of the marginalized, amplifies their experiences. It also views marginalized people as active creators of counter narratives. It also emphasizes processes and outcomes of oppression, of subjugation, and creates awareness about various forms of oppression, as well as facilitates coalition building, because individuals realize that the experiences of oppression that they've had are not singular or isolated. Scholars also perceive counter narratives as a methodology, because it encompasses not only the kind of data collected or the data collection techniques, but also how it is analyzed. So in this chapter, we use literature as counter narratives, and we borrow from both popular media and academic literature. So this brings us to the first prong of our analysis. So again, we re-emphasize that marginalized workers oscillate between precarious employment and unemployment, and this has been argued in the literature as well, which is why their struggles are reflective and indicative of broader community or societal considerations or intersectional oppressions per se. So we look at counter narratives as a link between workers' social identity, various forms of oppression, and various attributes of labor contestation. So speaking of attributes, this is our first attribute. We call it employee-employer ideological congruence. So the employment relationship is traditionally seen as a zero-sum game. So we ask if employees and employers' interests can coincide. Interestingly, we did see black and brown businesses closing shop temporarily, or even granting bereavement leaves for their workers to go participate in BLM protests. We've also seen strong support for the $15 minimum wage from Black businesses, given the disproportionate economic impact that the pandemic has had on communities of color. So we see this common interest emerging, anchored in common experiences of racism, which have transcended the class divide. So we ask if the struggle, workers in these contexts have engaged in, can they be theorized as labor contestation? Moving on to the next attribute, which is supra workplace causes for labor militancy. So causes for militant action that have originated outside the workplace are seen as relatively less relevant from the point of view of traditional IR scholarship. But anti-racist movements, for instance, M4BL or Movement for Black Lives, have vehemently argued that capitalism, you cannot talk about capitalism without discussing racism. So speaking of racism as a supra workplace cause of contention, we can bring in the Milwaukee Bucks Wildcat strike. It was one of the most popular examples of contentious action and one of the more controversial ones as well, when the team refused to play the scheduled games after Jacob Blake was murdered in Wisconsin. So what we see on the right is an empty court before one of their scheduled games. So on the face of it, superficially speaking, these actions don't seem to be directly linked to the employment relationship. So again, we ask if these can be theorized as labor contestation. The third attribute we have here is non-conventional tactics. We have divided this into 2 dimensions. So militant illegal actions are an example of radical action, and these were deemed illegal because most of these participants were either state or local government employees, but their struggles revolved around systemic racism. The second attribute we have, the second dimension we have here is about identifying targets for labor contestation. So as an example, we can see in this picture, immigrant workers protesting, and they were protesting in front of the New York City Hall. And the reason for their contentious action was that the city government had withdrawn economic support that their worker center was receiving. So we see that they were not directly engaging with their immediate employer. Right. So we again ask if their struggle can also be theorized as labor contestation. And we argue that all these events can indeed be looked at from the perspective of labor contestation if we broadened our imagination or conceptualization of how we study labor contestation and the need to go beyond workplace-based or traditional economic and institutional considerations. We can do so by accounting for intersectional identities of workers and reconceptualizing contentious action grounded in the 3 attributes that we discussed. Of course, the attributes are overlapping, meaning the examples that we used could be associated with more than one attribute. The attributes are also non-exhaustive, and they are applicable outside of these contexts as well. And doing so can also help us expand empirical cases, as Tamili and Maite Tapia have argued in their very, very important recently published paper. So there are also mutual gains to be had. So for marginalized workers, this can mean capacity building, especially if they receive the support of the broader labor movement. And this has gains for the labor movement as well, because this means bringing in new membership and innovation to facilitate much needed revitalization. So this involves a shift from economic justice to a holistic conceptualization of socioeconomic justice for the labor movement. So again, this is a work in progress. Any comments, questions, and feedback are most welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salil. Thank you to all our presenters. That was wonderful. I'm going to send out to all of you over chat a quick summary, which we won't go over in detail, but just to point out that these were some of the implications, again, that our presenters highlighted in their research in terms of the implications for theories of solidarity for stakeholders and labor contestation, as well as implications for practice. And so we see a lot of common themes in terms of willingness and openness to advocate expressions of solidarity, shared practices from a variety of origins, the possibility for mutual gains, and then all of our presenters also highlighted in various ways some of the challenges or constraints that can exist. So you have that PDF there if you want to take a look at that in more detail. It's also in our box folder, but I want to turn things over to Eric, who is going to give us some more comments from the perspective of the labor movement.
Thank you, Christine. Can folks hear me? Great. So I'm interested in how workers come together in solidarity to build power, both in the mainstream labor movement and in alternative formations such as worker centers and other ways of organizing. And all the panelists speak to these issues. I'll just talk for a minute about how I think about this. I've been in the labor movement for over 20 years as a union researcher and organizer. We have a crisis. We know the US union membership rate has been declining for 60 years. It's now about 10%. and only 6% in the private sector, an absolute crisis. Another metric, the number of NLRB elections, is organizing only tens of thousands of new workers each year, and we need a level of organizing that is at least 10 times greater. It's urgent that the labor movement, broadly conceived, finds ways to provide training and organizing assistance to millions of workers who want and need it. Regular union organizing campaigns at current staffing levels just aren't enough. As an example, I've been involved in the past year with a project called the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which was set up to provide training and organizing help for workers during the pandemic. Now, most of these campaigns, workers are just fighting for improvements on the job, not necessarily going through formal unionization and bargaining a contract, but they're still acting like a union, even without a formal bargaining relationship. We probably need to have a lot more organizing like that that's like less formal than the usual way, right? Now, I work for a construction union, the laborers, and the building trades historically have been mostly exclusive clubs for white male workers. It's less true today, but all the unions have more work to do, recruiting workers of color, women workers, and LGBTQ workers. Some of the things we're doing include organizing workers of color, some formerly incarcerated, into union construction jobs, building projects in their local communities. There's also a lot of programs to provide apprenticeship pathways for women workers. Another recent project, which I'm really proud of, ever since the murder of George Floyd last year and the latest Black Lives Matter protests, we're developing a race, labor, and solidarity training for the union's new organizers. We need to make sure our membership understands the importance of building workplace solidarity and has zero tolerance for racism, sexism, and homophobia on the job or at the union hall. Definitely a work in progress. Now, the panelists today have given me a lot to think about. As I said, a major theme I see running through all the work of the panelists is understanding the development of solidarity among workers and through various ways of organizing and across organizations. Andrew's research focused on entertainment workers during COVID to see what kind of collective solidarity emerged among what we would consider independent contractors. I think this has important implications for organizing what are typically called gig economy workers, right? I find it really fascinating that many of the workers use digital platforms to produce collective nights of entertainment. I think that's a phrase Andrew uses. I see this as an example of creating what is called the solidarity economy. It basically sounds like the workers were running like a cooperative, right? The workers who were involved developed a sense of solidarity and strengthened their class consciousness regarding attitudes towards management. No doubt some of them wondered, what do they need employers for? Why couldn't they just keep running these events themselves? I'm sure that a thought occurred to them, and hopefully they will do that. But other workers found the collective events to be, I think Andrew in his paper called it a cultural mismatch. To me, this represents perhaps an example of the challenges of finding ways to organize with workers who felt alienated by this kind of collective project, right? Now, speaking more generally, in any organizing campaign, we always train workers to reach out beyond their political and friendship comfort zone to talk with all kinds of workers in their workplace. So similarly, these entertainment workers, if they want to strengthen their network, have to grapple with ways to reach out to those who experience the collective events negatively and find other ways to organize or talk with those folks. Carla presented on a survey of UAW members who were on strike at GM, which was a really important strike. I actually visited the picket line one day to find out if regular workers acted in solidarity with temp workers at the company. The first survey found attitudes of solidarity with temp workers, but in the final contract voting, workers are more inclined to ratify the agreement, even though it did not include the improvements for temp workers that were demanded by the union, or all the improvements. But there's a larger context here which we should understand, and Carla raised this a bit, particularly the issue of union satisfaction. I heard a lot of criticism of the way the UAW handled the strike, that it was not well planned, that members were not surveyed or informed about the contract demands or what was happening in bargaining. Basically, the union didn't run an inclusive contract campaign. That's what we would call it. I'm thinking particularly of the reporting in labor notes about the strike, which quoted a number of workers that were frustrated that they didn't gain more through the strike. It's all disappointing. Best practice contract campaigns have widespread member involvement in the fight. There's a recent report by McAlevey and others on democratically structured contract campaigns, which argues that better results are obtained with more meaningful participation. This raises questions about whether the UAW could have done more in their contract and strike planning to fight for temp workers, or to eliminate their multiple employment tiers, which still exist in the contract. And we recognize that workers are typically pretty exhausted after 40 days on strike and are likely to ratify what the leadership puts in front of them. But I wouldn't want to overinterpret the contract vote as the members' lack of solidarity in this issue. And I don't think Carla's doing that. There's many issues combined here. It could also be a measure of the lack of the union leadership's commitment to fight on this issue and the members' frustration with that. Turning to Ben, I'm more familiar with Ben's work on union and worker-centered collaboration. And as I said, worker centers have grown over the last few decades as an alternative way for workers to organize. It's absolutely critical that unions and worker centers find ways to work and win together. Ben shows the challenges in this. This area is definitely understudied. Ben discussed 2 case studies. I found them both very interesting. One was a successful home care services organizing campaign that got a union contract. The other involved a campaign with my union and a worker center at a demolition contractor. In that campaign, there was a union election that was successful, but unfortunately no contract was achieved. My understanding though is that the workers did get some improvements in wages and working conditions and hopefully are stronger after that organizing. Now, obviously both campaigns bring up issues of culture, trust, communication, and organizational resources that have to be navigated. I found it interesting that Ben raised the issue of the memorandum of agreement or memorandum of understanding, which outlines expectations. And maybe that's critical. We didn't have that in the second case. In any case, we need a lot more of these collaborations, and I really hope we're getting better at it. And a key question is the extent to which the 2 parties can build on each other's collective strengths. And finally, Salil asks us to broaden our understanding of protest action among marginalized workers, looking beyond worker struggles against their employer, which is the thing I always think about, and examining several other possibilities. I only have time to comment on one of them. I think that it was the first example Salil gave, the common encounters with injustice experienced by minority employers and marginalized workers, and actions by workers in collaboration with employers. Now, this is very interesting, as Salil brought up. This has come up over the last year during the wave of Black Lives Matter protests. There was a debate about whether some of these actions counted as strikes. So an example is when workers convinced their employers to close the business as part of the protests in their town. Does that count as a strike? Does the employer's action matter here, or is it primarily the workers' initiative that matters, right? Another example from a few years ago is when a coalition of New York City Yemeni bodega owners shut down their stores for a day in protest of Trump's Muslim travel ban. How do we understand that action? Is it a kind of strike or a boycott, or does it matter? From my perspective, I always kind of want to center the workers. What matters most in any struggle, I think, is did workers strengthen their own independent power in these fights? I would worry about too much reliance on convincing employers to do the right thing, right? But all of this has implications for political strikes and general strikes, which is something we don't talk about enough, and something we certainly need to discuss more in this country. So that was fast, I know. Those are some thoughts. I thank the panelists for their presentations. I found something interesting in all of them.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric, so much for those thoughts and reactions and questions you've raised. Are there any, I know we're running a little short on time on our discussion Q&A, but are there any comments that or questions anyone would like to offer? I don't see any hands. I may, oh, go ahead. I heard somebody.
Yeah, I have my hand up, but I don't know if anyone.
Oh, sorry. Oh, there you, sorry. I'm looking at the wrong list.
So first, thanks for these great presentations, the discussion, and also you're really elevating the role of the chair here, Christine, with the, I'm chairing something tomorrow. I feel like I need to start making PDFs and stuff. So thanks for your work. Just a very brief question for Andrew, I think, based on great presentations again from everyone, but just for Andrew, can you give an example of these kind of when there's resistance within these communal projects, when there's a mismatch, I guess, that's what I meant. It was like a line in your PowerPoint that talks about there could be a mismatch within these communal projects, and then it becomes harder to build that type of solidarity. Could you give an example of that what you found through your field work?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I zoomed through my data, but I had an example in there specifically of Pepper, who was talking about sort of what I see as the embodied experience of what actually went into the digital practices of doing this sorts of work. And so what I found was that Pepper was socialized into doing this type of work to appreciate the sensual experiences of work. And so for Pepper and for a lot of others, participating in queer nightlife is about the sensual experience and sort of the escape from normal society and being able to just have sensual experiences. And so the practices, the shared platform, it wasn't that it was a shared platform, it's just the work completely made no sense because there was no opportunity for that. Whereas for a lot of other queer entertainers, they were socialized into the work in a way such that they prioritized self-expression, and that what they were able to do was expressive. And so this was a fantastic venue for them to continue doing that sort of work, because they were able to maintain that sort of expressiveness in what they were doing, that they could even explore like things that probably wouldn't land in a club, like doing a slower number. So for them, it was this cultural fit because they were able to sort of sustain the meaning of their work through these cultural practices.
Are there other questions?
A question mainly reacting to Carla's presentation, but if anybody else has thoughts, I'd love to hear it. I'm curious about whether campaigns, either through a strike, union negotiations, or more informally, that try to center concerns of more marginalized groups or the kind of peripheral temp workforce, can have these mutual gains for increasing their level of engagement and mobilization in ongoing union activity or other kinds of organizing. I guess I'm wondering, to some extent, is there can the focus of the campaign itself sort of draw people in, or do you need to have sort of leadership from the outset, coming from those segments that are sort of most affected by these issues? Curious your thoughts.
If I may add, as I mentioned in the presentation, I think that a clear example that comes from the European Union, from Germany specifically, it shows that it goes to a structure, and how the structure can really provide the necessary votes to kind of collide both interests of both kind of workers, the periphery and the core groups.
Thank you. Do we have time maybe to squeeze in one more if anyone has one? Any other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Victor.
This might be for Salil, but it could be for the other panelists. But I teach at the one of my teaching gigs at UCLA is at the law school at the Critical Race Studies program. I teach a class of how to integrate critical race studies into community lawyering. And every time I teach that class, I keep thinking, well, why can't we do something similar with the labor movement? Like, is there a way to integrate critical race perspective and critical race studies into either internal curriculums in the labor movement or workshops with unions? Can it happen? Because we seem to be able to do with the concept of lawyers, community lawyers and civil rights lawyers, but can we do it within the labor movement?
So fortunately, we have the editors of the 2022 Lira volume on this call, and I would love to hear their perspectives about this issue, if they may.
I won't take up too much time. I'll just say really quickly that I do labor education, and I bring in critical race theory and intersectionality into my trainings for unions and other groups of workers all the time. I won't agree to do a session unless they're clear that this is what they're going to get when they call me.
Hi, Victor. I'm Tammy. I feel weird answering on someone else's panel, but we're one of the volume editors that Salil just mentioned. Maite, Tapia, and I also are doing some research on intersectional organizing that specifically tries to answer that question for the labor movement in terms of integrating critical race theory in the strategic worker organizing. And we've identified some key elements, and we really hope that we get that published soon. But yes, we're working on it, and we're really happy to share a draft of the paper with you and would love your feedback.
Yes, and I was just going to say, I was going to throw it right back to Salil because I taught a CRT and labor course, and it had a mix of, students and worker leaders and longtime union members in the class. And I feel like we were able to do so much in a short period of time. Because the sense that I got from people was we're having the conversation that oftentimes is happening at the back table or the water cooler, what have you, when the conversation at the front of the room feels very much so like it's missing something, right? And so I was just going to say, Salil, you could probably speak better to that in terms of what your experience is.
That's quite a tough question to answer. I've dabbled a bit into intersectionality since a couple years, but I've gotten recently introduced to critical race theory. And I was amazed to see how we talk about capitalism and racism as these two separate phenomena. And for me, critical race theory is something that brings the various oppressions that we face in society together. So I see it as this integrative theory, if I may call that, and that helps answer a number of questions that I had previously. I'm not sure if that was a coherent response, but that is where I'm at this point.
Excellent, thank you, Salil. You all don't mind holding on for one more minute because it's just the happy hour coming up in a little bit. Ben, do you want to just answer the question in the chat about unions and worker centers, whether they are sharing knowledge and skills on effective representation?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. The answer is yes, but they're not doing it enough. One of the big things that came out of my dissertation was that I think there need to be, so I'm glad to hear this thing about CRT and labor. I'm a big believer in, intersectionality, and I did speak about that in my dissertation and my papers. And one of the things I talked about in implications is that unions and worker centers have a lot to teach each other in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of structures. So there is some dialogue going on, but not nearly enough. The LIFT Fund, which the AFL-CIO and a number of foundations run, that's one of the main vehicles, but it also does occur through the central labor councils. Like in Boston, there are some joint trainings, and I'm happy to talk further about that offline, but I'm submitting several articles for peer review right now, so just keep an eye out or drop me a line. I'll put my email in the chat.
Great. Well, thank you. And I just to, I guess, close out, I just wanted to elevate Eric's point that he made at the end of his remarks too about questions of power and how all of these different forms of collective action, how we think about it in that context, those questions. And I think it's a really interesting, you raised a number of points relating to all of the different presenters that have, I think, given all of us a lot to think about. So we really appreciate it. It's really exciting to hear about all of your research. These were a set of great presentations and papers. Can't wait to see what you all do next with them. Any questions or anything like that, you have all the speakers' bios and feel free to reach out to them individually. So thank you so much. Thanks for sticking with us and see you later at the happy hour.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Christine. That went really well.
Good, thank you. That was great. I really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Christine, thanks for making the slide. It was really helpful for everyone to see what we were really talking about as a group.
I hope I know I edited it. I have a tendency to be very wordy, and so I'm always trying to make things concise, but I hope I represented your input and your points well.
You did. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
That was
Christine.
great.
Well, yeah, keep us posted. If you ever want to talk about research, let me know.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
right, talk soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.